Greetings in the name of Jesus Messiah, or Yahshua the Messiah, King, Prophet, and High Priest of the earth. My name is Vincent Berardi, Rochester, New York. I've been active on Facebook since around April 9th, 2016. Have various YouTube teachings on Google. And my teaching and prophetic ministry in writing to various political and religious organizations and churches actually dates back to the 1986 to 1990 time frame. Today's topic is about the Patriarch Joseph. He was a human being who walked by the RUACH of YHWH God by way of dreams or visions. And although he didn't understand it initially, after years or decades, they were showed to all the world to see that he was 100% tried and tested oracle or spokesperson for the God of the Jewish Christian faith. We'll start off in Genesis chapter 37, the LEB translation. And Jacob settled in the land of the sojourning of his father in the land of Canaan. Verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zippor, the wives of his father, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. So he was simply a shepherd, a humble shepherd, 17 years old, pretty young, teenager actually. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, for he was a son of his old age. And he made a robe with long sleeves for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and were not able to speak peaceably to him. Verse 5 of Genesis chapter 37, verse 5. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And he said to them, listen now to this dream that I dreamed. And behold, we were binding sheaves in the midst of the field, and behold, my sheaf stood up, and it remained standing. Then behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Verse 8. Then his brothers said to him, will you really rule over us? And they hated him even more on account of his dream and because of his words. So a lot of times there's jealousy or envy, or family members may not understand the dreams or visions. When you're young in this, aren't seasoned yet, you may not understand what the true long-term meanings were. But so he continues. Chapter 37, verse 9. Then he dreamed yet another dream, and he told it to his brothers. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream again, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Verse 10. And he told it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Will I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the ground to you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So then you go on in Genesis chapter 37, 12 through 36, Joseph was sold by his brothers. Genesis chapter 39, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, he's wrongly accused, gets thrown in prison. Joseph interprets two prisoners' dreams in Genesis chapter 40, 1 through N. So now we're continuing with the dreams and interpretations. He was beginning to mature in it, I guess. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1. And it happened After these things, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker did wrong against their lord, against the king of Egypt. Verse 2, and Pharaoh was angry with the two officials, with the chief cupbearer and chief baker. Verse 3, and he put them in custody in the house of the chief of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. Verse 4, and the chief of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they were in custody many days. Verse 5, and the two of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed a dream, each his own dream, with its own interpretation. Now these two other people had dreams, but they didn't understand the interpretations, okay? And people can try to guess at the interpretations, but only the seasoned, tried and tested prophets or oracles for God, seers, that type of thing, will frequently have the correct interpretation, and everybody else is, guessing. Verse 6, when Joseph came to them in the morning, he looked at them, and behold, they were troubled. Verse 7, and he asked the court officials of Pharaoh were with him in the custody of the master's house, why are your faces so sad? Verse 8, and they said to him, we each dreamed a dream, but there's no one to interpret it. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So when he's saying the interpretations belong to God, when you read the Old Testament, people who had the RUACH of God, of Yahweh on them, they were empowered with dreams and visions and word of knowledge, word of wisdom, discerning of spirits, things like that. They were empowered to fulfill the mission for which they were called to do. Okay? So he's saying, do not interpretation belong to God? Please tell them to me. So if you have the RUACH of Yahweh God upon you and you're a faithful minister, what's the interpretation? Or what's the probable interpretation? So verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, and he said, in my dream, now behold, there was a vine before me. Verse 10. And on the vine were 3 branches, and as it budded, its blossoms came up, and its clusters of grapes grew ripe. Verse 11, and the cup of Pharaoh was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into the cup of Pharaoh. Then I placed the cup in the hand of Pharaoh. Verse 12, and Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches, these are 3 days. Verse 13, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and will restore you to your office, and you shall put the cup of Pharaoh into his hand, as was formerly the custom when you were his cupbearer. Verse 14, but remember me when it goes well with you, and please may you show kindness with respect to me, and mention me to Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house, or this prison. Verse 15, for I was surely kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me in this pit, in this prison. Verse 16. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good for this other person, he said to Joseph, I also dreamed. And in my dream, now behold, there were 3 baskets of bread upon my head. Verse 17. And in the upper basket were all sorts of baked foods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket upon my head. Verse 18. Then Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets, these are 3 days. Verse 19. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Verse 20. And it happened on that 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker in the midst of his servants. Verse 21. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing position, and he placed the cup in the hand of Pharaoh. Verse 22. But the chief baker he hanged, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Verse 23, but the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So that was a specific interpretation for those two people. And just because in the dreams you see 3 baskets or three this, doesn't always necessarily mean 3 days. But he had the RUACH of YHWH God. He had the word of knowledge, word of wisdom, discerning of spirits, that type of thing. He correctly interpreted these dreams for these two fellows. Okay, so Joseph interprets. Now, then we go into Pharaoh's dream in chapter 41. And it happened after 2 full years, Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he was standing by the Nile, and behold, 7 cows were well built and fat, were coming up from the Nile, and they gazed among the reeds. Verse 3, and behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood beside those cows in the bank of the Nile. Verse 4, and the ugly and gaunt cows ate the 7 well-built and fat cows, and then Pharaoh awoke. Verse 5, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were coming out of one stalk. Verse 6, and behold, 7 thin ears of grain, scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. Verse 7, and the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears of grain. And then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Verse 8 of chapter 41 of Genesis. And it happened that in the morning his spirit was troubled. His spirit, his mind, he was physically troubled. And he sent and called all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told his dream to them, but they had no interpretation for Pharaoh. Verse 9, then the chief of the cupbearer spoke with Pharaoh, saying, I remember my sins today. Verse 10, Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in the custody of the house of the chief of the guard. See, he remembered, he was giving direct testimony that this other fellow dream and interpretation, prophetic word came to pass. So he's actually giving direct testimony, first-hand testimony to a person in high power. So verse 10 of chapter 41, Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the house of the chief of the guard. Verse 11, and we dreamed the dream one night, he and I, each with a dream that had a meaning. Verse 12, and there with us a young man, a Hebrew servant of the chief of the guard, and he told him the dream. We told him the dream, and he interpreted our dreams for us. Each according to his dream he interpreted. Verse 13, and it happened just as he interpreted to us, so it was. He restored me to my office, and him he hanged. This other fellow he hanged. Verse 14, and then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they brought him quickly from the prison, and he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. So here was a ruler, Pharaoh, who some people considered God-man, but he was so disturbed by the dream, he was concerned about what implication it might have for his kingdom. And when he learned that there was a genuine oracle of God, a prophet who correctly interpreted the dream by this one chosen witness, he called for Joseph and said, come here, I want you to have words with me. Okay? That showed that this ruler was hungry and teachable, meek. So, verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly from the prison, and he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. Verse 15, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamed the dream, but there is none to interpret it. Now I have heard concerning you that you When you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Verse 16, and Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not my power, but God will answer concerning the well-being of Pharaoh. Again, he understood that the RUACH of Yahweh God was upon him. God could reveal the interpretation to him, give him word of knowledge, word of wisdom, discerning of spirits, and give a correct answer about the well-being of Pharaoh and his kingdom, that type of thing. Verse 17 of Genesis 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, now in my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. 18. Behold, 7 cows, well built and fat, were coming up from the Nile, and they gazed among the reeds. Verse 19. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, very ugly and gaunt, never having seen any as them in all the land of Egypt in ugliness. Verse 20. And the thin and the ugly cows ate the former 7 healthy cows. Verse 21. And when they went into their bellies, it could not be known that they went into their bellies, for their appearance was as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. Verse 22. Then I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears of grain were coming out of one stalk, full and good. Verse 23, and behold, 7 withered ears of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. Verse 24, and the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 good ears of grain. And I was told the magicians, I told the magicians, his religious leaders, his occultists, spiritists, but there was none to explain it to the king, the Pharaoh. Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Verse 26. The 7 good cows, these are 7 years. And the 7 good ears of grain, these are 7 years. The dreams are one. Verse 27, and the 7 thin and ugly cows coming up after them, they are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears of grain scorched by the east wind, they are also 7 years of famine. Verse 28, this is the word that I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do for Pharaoh's kingdom. Verse 29, behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the whole land of Egypt. Now, let's go back. Say he didn't have this dream. Say he didn't have any interpretations, prophetic warnings, admonitions on what could be done. He would have just had 7 years of great abundance, and then he would have started getting into the 7 years of drought, severe drought and famine and things. And after 2 or 3 years, he might have said, the global warming, all these things are happening. It's just Mother Nature. It's not divine judgments or anything. It has nothing to do with prophets. But here, the ruler had the dream, and Joseph was commissioned, and he was put in a place where he could advise the Pharaoh with the interpretation of dream. And the interpretation of dream come from the RUACH of Yahweh God, and Yahweh God has been gracious to let you know what's going to happen to your kingdom. Verse 28. This is the word that I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 29. Behold, the 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the whole land of Egypt. Verse 30. Then 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will consume the land. 31. The abundance in the land will not be known because of the famine that follows, for it will be very heavy. Verse 32, now concerning the repetition of the dream, again, here was another insight, word of knowledge, word of wisdom, interpretation. concerning the repetition of the dream twice to Pharaoh, it is because the matter is established by God, and God will do it quickly. Verse 33. Now then, let Pharaoh select a man. So here, with the word of knowledge, word of wisdom, the oracle speaking for God says, Pharaoh, for your kingdom you should select a man discerning and wise, and let him set him over the land of Egypt. Verse 34, let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint supervisors over the land, and let him take 1/5 from the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Now this was word of knowledge, word of wisdom. Why did he pick 1/5? Why didn't he pick 1/10? Why didn't he pick 50%? Why did he pick 1/5? It was word of knowledge, word of wisdom. Okay, verse 35. So so he was supposed to take 1/5 from the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty. Verse 35. Then let them gather all the food of these coming good years, and let them pile up grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. So they built these granaries and storehouses near the cities, things like that, so they could have 1/5 of the food for the 7 good years and have it readily available when it was needed. Verse 36. Then the food shall be as a deposit for the land for the 7 years of the famine that will be in the land of Egypt, that the land will not perish on account of the famine. Verse 37. And the plan was good in the eyes of Pharaoh. Again, he was hungry and meek and coachable. The oracle didn't say, pick me. He just gave him word of knowledge, word of wisdom, advice. Pick a wise and discerning man. And Pharaoh, the ruler, after receiving his word of knowledge, word of wisdom, discerning of spirits, his plan, he said, verse 37, he says, and the plan was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, in the eyes of all his servants. 38. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? The Spirit of God, the RUACH of God. Verse 39, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and to your word all my people shall submit. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Verse 41, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Verse 42, and Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his finger and put it on the finger of Joseph. And he clothed him with garments of fine linen, and he put a chain of gold around his neck. Verse 43, and he had made him ride in his second chariot. And they cried out before him, kneel. And Pharaoh set him over all the land of Egypt. Verse 44, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your consent no one will lift his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt. Verse 45, and Pharaoh called the name of Joseph Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Verse 46, now Pharaoh was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and traveled through the whole land of Egypt. Verse 47, and the land produced a plenty of 7 years of abundance. Verse 48, and he gathered all the food of the 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he stored the food in the cities, the food in the field that surrounded each city he stored in the midst. Verse 49, and Joseph piled up grain like the sand of the sea in great abundance until he stopped counting it, for it could not be counted. Again, it's a metaphor. Verse 50, And before the years of famine came, Asra, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore 2 sons to him, and Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has caused me to forget all my hardship in all my father's house. Verse 52, and the name of the second he called Ephraim, and he said, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortune. Verse 53, in the 7 years of abundance which in the land of Egypt came to an end. Verse 54 through 57 talks about the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, and there was famine in all the countries, but in the land of Egypt there was no food. So basically all the areas around Egypt were stricken by this famine, this weather change. But the land of Egypt, there was food. Verse 55, and when all the land of Egypt was hungry, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. Pharaoh said to all the land of Egypt, go to Joseph. What he says to you, you must do. Verse 56, and the famine was over the whole land. Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold food to the Egyptians. Famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Verse 57, and every land came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, but the famine was severe in every land. Obviously not every land across oceans, but every land within traveling distance, that type of thing. So that's the end of this. Now I want to note that he was 30 years old when he was before Pharaoh, and this later stuff started to happen, and he was 17 when he first had his dreams, and that he didn't understand. So over a period of 13 years, now you see him elevated in a position of authority and power, and he's beginning to forget the hardships that he was wrongly had to endure previously. This is end for this part 1. I will have to start with a part 2 on this same topic. Thank you. In the name of Yahshua the Messiah, amen.